My name is John Kemp. I'm a Comox resident. I'm originally from the States, and I came to Canada in '66. I've been here 42 years. Taught at a community college in Ontario for 28 years and moved out here in '98. I have daughters and grandkids at it. Basically, why I was at that protest is I definitely believe that Stephen Harper has the same basic ideology and philosophy as and a direct lineage from the Reagan, Thatcher, Bush type views. And I think people can see that there's a kind of that the Bush presidency has been a great, more or less, disaster for the United States. And I think that's quite evident now in foreign policy and getting bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now there's a big financial meltdown that's going to have repercussions all over the world. I think Stephen Harper, and I've looked at these things quite seriously over a period of time and researched articles and whatnot. One article in the Thai newspaper was talking about the ideological and philosophical roots of Stephen and Harper and Bush more or less coincide, and that this article said it goes back to a philosopher named Leo Strauss, who taught at the University of Chicago and influenced such neoconservatives in the Bush administration as Paul Wolfowitz and others who have been advisors to Bush. And there's a connection between the University of Chicago School and Leo Strauss and the Calgary School in Alberta, where Stephen Harper went and worked on his master's degree and whatnot. And there's a kind of a Leo Straussian school there of neoconservatives that have heavily influenced Stephen Harper. So what I believe that Stephen Harper, I wouldn't say it's a hidden agenda. I just think he is basically a committed neoconservative with sort of a pro-market fundamentalist view, and in fact a kind of an anti-government view. And it's somewhat misleading and fraudulent for a person to belong to a party and try to use democracy and electoral process to get elected when their primary aim is to more or less downsize government as far as possible, do away with social programs, public sector programs, and transfer power and wealth and decision making from the public sector and government over to the private sector. My view of democracy is it's fundamentally government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The very meaning of the word means self-government of the population as a whole. Governments like the Harris government in Ontario, the Bush government, Klein, even Tony Blair in Britain, they believe in downsizing government and transferring everything over to the private sector. I think Harper likes to use private sector analogies, and I think if you hired someone as a chief executive officer to run a business and their aim, more or less unstated, was to gain control of the business and try to downsize the business, decrease its sales and profits, and more or less run it into a dysfunctional state, that person would be fired if those views were known. He just recently said that Stéphane Dion would be fired if his policies were that of a chief executive in a private corporation. But I think it'll be somewhat disastrous if Harper gets a majority government. I think in our system, the Canadian system, that you can have a situation where a majority government is virtually an elected dictatorship. Because the opposite, James Laxer in one of his articles said that Harper called this election because he said Parliament was getting dysfunctional, and if he gets majority government, not only will Parliament be dysfunctional, it'll be totally irrelevant. Or what he said, it won't be worth a warm pitcher of spit. That's what Claxter said, and I agree with him. And we had a similar situation in B.C. when we wound up with Gordon Campbell's liberal government having a majority and two NDP members there. So he could be in for 4 or 5 years. And the incredible thing to me is that the economic orientation and policies that he adheres to, I mean, we have a dramatic example going on in the States now that those ideas and that policy and that are virtually intellectually bankrupt, and in fact have caused problems all over the world. In the past 3 decades, they've caused problems in third world countries that have opened up their markets to multinationals, and the IMF has come in and told them that they've got to more or less privatize their agricultural sectors and produce food for export, and they've lost the capacity to have food security, and we have a global food crisis. We have global energy crisis, global warming. Sir Isaac Stern, who did a report on global warming for the Tony Blair government, made the statement that global warming and climate change was one of the greatest market failures in history because the private economy and globalized corporations on the scale have not, you know, the environment is not their main priority. It's profits and expansion on a global scale. I think we can look at the current financial crisis and we see the same thing. The financial sector of the economy, I've seen some figures on this, and it's referred to like we had globalization and financialization, because in the United States, manufacturing has been hollowed out, chipped out to Mexico and China and things like this. And the manufacturing sector, I read a comment that says it's about 12% of the gross national product, 12%. And the financial sector, about 20%. And then when you look at what the financial sector does, the financial sector is both parasitical and it is functional, because the system is based on banking and credit and all that to keep it going. But on the other hand, in the financial sector, they're not producing real wealth or goods and services. They are just shifting money and funds around in speculation. And so what we've seen is the total deregulation of the financial sector, and then them inventing all sorts of sophisticated financial instruments, derivatives and whatnot, and the system is totally corrupt and totally out of control. And once you give the private sector free rein and global unfettered capitalism, then you're in deep, deep trouble. And I'm old enough to know, I was born in 1931. As a child, I experienced the Depression. I remember those conditions as from childhood memories there, and grew up during the Second World War. And that Depression was preceded by a big boom of the 20s and all sorts of financial speculation and whatnot. So I think Stephen Harper has a direct lineage from and I've read his biography and whatnot, and I know he was a great admirer of Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, economist, and he has a direct lineage from Reagan, Thatcher, and he's an ideological cousin of George Bush. I have no faith or confidence in his leadership. I don't think he is a strong leader. He is a weak follower. Under his government, Canada has had virtually no independent foreign policy, military policy, defense policy, or security policy. And he has not voiced one criticism of the Bush presidency. And there are many American writers, including Naomi Wolf and others, who have written books, 2 books now, about how far George Bush has move the United States towards fascism. And if you read Naomi Wolf's book or look on Google Video, you'll see her arguments there. So Harper and he recently, in the news in the last couple of days, has been charged with plagiarizing a speech from the Australian Prime Minister. So it's not a difficult job to be Prime Minister if you have all your instructions more or less written for you or scripted either by Washington or the corporate sector in Canada, from the Canadian Council of Chief Executive Officers or think tanks like the Fraser Institute or C.D. Howe and everything. And no wonder you just, if you're just reading off speeches and executing strips, then either you're sort of a robotic or puppet, I would say. I would use the word puppet. And so these are fairly strong feelings, I realize, that I'm voicing, but they're based on my life experience and some careful, considered thought regarding Mr. Harper. So that's basically it. I was at that demonstration outside as a small effort to show that I thought what was going on there was undemocratic in itself. This was a meeting that was just popped up in the papers one day and occurred the next, and then they had the audacity to say in the paper that in order to attend the meeting you had to be registered 24 hours in advance. And I doubt very seriously if 90% or more of the public could possibly have met that criteria. So it was obviously engineered in such a way that people who had advance notice, such as the Chamber of Commerce and the Conservative Party and business groups and whatnot, did have the 24 hours, and so they could get into the meeting. And then also prior to that, well, there's the situation, which I won't get into in much detail, about the Conservative candidate mentioning that he would not attend any all candidates meeting unless they were sponsored by a nonpartisan group. And his idea of who a nonpartisan group is a Chamber of Commerce. And I think he made a statement to the effect that the Council of Canadians is not a nonpartisan group. So anyway, these indicate to me who their audience is and who they serve. Their idea of democracy is democracy by corporations, of corporations and for corporations, or by business, of business and for business. I don't believe in that. One other thing that just occurred to me, I saw a comment by an American fellow, I think his name is Gordon Nyquist, and I was looking that up because I thought he had made a speech to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce recently, but I looked him up and he has made a lot of speeches to a lot of different Chamber of Commerce. But his one famous remark he made is that he belongs to American Taxpayers Federation or something like that, and they don't like taxes and they don't like government. And his famous remark was, we want to cut government down to a size that we can throw it into the bathtub and drown it. And I basically think that Mr. Harper has similar motivations. He wants to cut government down to a minimal size, and you shift power and assets and decision making over to the private sector. And recently I told some people I was discussing some things with that I don't think people realize that when they talk about the tax cuts, that let's take it to the limit and wind up, say, with zero taxes, zero government, and what we would then have zero democracy. Because Western democracy is based on the nation state. It is not based on capitalist economies within the nation state. And the only influence you have in a democratic sense is in the public sector and with the government, where there's one person, one vote. And in the private sector, and I would call it the corporate sector, because it's not a free market economy, it's an economy dominated by large corporations in every sector. And in that sector, you can take your little tax dollars and go over in that sector, and you get $1, one vote, not one person, one vote. And you can vote your dollars at the dollar store or the thrift shop or Walmart. But if you got $1, you got one vote as far as influencing that society as a whole through that sector. If you got $1 billion, you got 1 billion votes. And the problem is that power in the corporate sector, it becomes concentrated, and that sector spills over into the public sector in the government. And ultimately you have what is in the United States a totally dysfunctional, corrupt democracy. And even presidential candidates, John Edwards, Dennis Kucinich, have stated that it's so totally corrupt that you basically have a corporate state, not a democratic state. Both those parties are basically owned by corporate money, and John Edwards and others have said this. It's not. So I believe in a vision of Canada that is an independent, sovereign, democratically governed nation for the people, that has a Canadian economy that functions for the needs of the Canadian population as a whole, mainly. That and it's not just an open economy that is a regional sector within a North American economy that functions primarily for the benefit of corporations, banks, and not the needs of ordinary people. The other danger about Stephen Harper, and it hasn't even been mentioned in this election, is the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America is going on and has been going on for 4 or 5 years. Started under a liberal government, carried over with Harper. And that is an extremely dangerous process. The only people that are actively involved in it is major corporations, who primarily initiated by the Canadian Council of Chief Executive Officers and the several other American groups of similar nature. And they are determining regulation, harmonizing regulations and everything. Want to harmonize the security and have a defense perimeter all around the continent, including Mexico. Common tariff, eventually a common currency, maybe, and there would be no chance. And it's not like the European Union, where you have relatively equal sovereign nations that are, and they have a political body also, the European Parliament. You don't enter into this type of arrangement with a globalized so-called superpower that is rapidly collapsing, but that is carrying on a war against the world declared by George Bush. And it is a very dangerous thing that the Canadian military has been so integrated and harmonized with the U.S. that I don't think people are really aware of some of the things that have occurred. Within the last year, there was a bilateral agreement between Canada and the United States that American or Canadian troops could operate within either country if there was a so-called major emergency, like a pandemic or whatnot. Within the past month or so, Mr. Bush is going to moving a battalion of troops from Iraq for civilian duty in the United States. And that is another one of his many non-constitutional action, because there's a U.S. law called Posse Comitatus that goes way back to the early years of not using militia or military forces in a civilian context in the United States. So there are many, many reasons to be concerned still about Mr. Harper, and I hope that this election is so fast and so furious. To me, that's a drawback to democracy too. It should be over a much longer period. more room for discussion and thoughtfulness about it, and it's somewhat frightening that it's only 2 weeks away, and I hope that in the intervening period people will give a lot of thought and consideration just to where they're going and what future they want for this country.